discussions of church history. I appreciate you watching. In the last video I recorded, I talked to you about the word schism, which is a Greek word for separation or split or division. And we looked at the first major schism that happened in the Christian church. Again, as I said last time, there have been many different false doctrines, false prophets, uh, movements that have gone off in wrong directions. But these tend to be not really Christian at the heart. And so they're not the same as schisms because they're not permanent divisions of the real Christian church. Rather, they're people who aren't real Christians going off and separating out from the church. As John says in 1 John, he says, they were not of us because they went out from us. So those are not schisms, they're false teachings, false movements. But schisms are things that happen within the actual Christian church, and they divide us and we stay divided. So the first ever schism was the one that happened after the Council of Chalcedon, way back in the 400s AD, right? When it was an issue of the nature of Christ. You know, is he two natures in one person? Is he, or did the divine and the human just really fuse in such a way as to become only one person? And of course, those who believe the latter, they're called Monophysites. And then there are others who are called Miaphysites with MIA instead of MONO. And they are the ones who believe that there's two natures in Christ, but they're really in a union. So it's really close, you know, very almost the same thing. But yet they're considered orthodox, whereas Monophysites are not. They're considered heretical. By the way, let me just point this out. If you've ever gone to an orthodontist, it'll help you understand what orthodox means. Ortho means straight, and dontos are teeth. So an orthodontist makes your teeth straight, but orthodoxy is straight teaching. So that which is there is the word orthodox, which we use for people who believe in correct Christian theology. We say their theology is orthodox because it's straight teaching, it's correct biblical teaching. But then there is also the Greek Orthodox Church, or the Worldwide Orthodox Fellowship Communion of Churches. And there is the Oriental Orthodox Communion of Churches. The Oriental Orthodox churches are the Monophysites. The rest of the Orthodox world, which would include Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Syrian Orthodox, whatever, those are the ones, that's one of the three main divisions of Christendom. We have the Roman Catholic, the Greek Orthodox or the Orthodox, and the Protestant. Those are the main divisions, okay? Now, having talked about that first division that happened after the Council of Chalcedon, I want to talk to you about the next great division. And this next schism that I want to talk to you about is far more well known. It's something that more people are aware of, I think, and more people pay attention to. Many people would say it's the first schism. It's not, as I pointed out. But some would think that this is the first schism. And what I'm referring to here is the schism that took place between the Eastern and Western parts of the Christian church. This schism developed over centuries. It didn't happen at one point in time, but the official date that is often mentioned as the time when it happened is 1054 AD. That's when a particular event happens, which I'll mention here in a minute, explain in a minute. But the actual division between East and West was not something that happened in a one-time event, but it was actually something that just went on and on for centuries of time until there was just a definite break. There were various factors which caused this break. One was simple geography. You see, so much of the Christian world was in the East, and so many others were in the West. And as you remember, as you understand, back in those days, Transportation and communication took a while, took a long time before you'd even get a letter from somebody or get news that a certain church was teaching something you considered heresy or whatever. So geography was a big factor. And along that same line, another big factor was that there was actually a division in the Roman Empire at that time. And that division developed over a period of time as well. But especially in the 300s AD, under the Emperor Diocletian, the Roman Empire was so spread out to the east and to the west that it took months for people on one side to hear about events happening on another side or about problems. An emperor couldn't handle all the problems of this big empire because while he'd be dealing with wars over in the west, over in Europe somewhere, suddenly there's another revolution or uprising that's occurred somewhere way over in again with the Persians or whatever, way over in the east. So it was just a huge empire scattered all over the place. And the Roman Empire, Diocletian was the guy who first divided it and said, we're going to have east and west, we're going to have two emperors. And eventually they reached the point where they had four because they had two Caesars and two, they called them Augusti. And so they actually had four leaders because you'd have a Caesar and his Augustus, or I get it mixed up. It might be the Augustus and his Caesar. And that would kind of be his second in command who would come and take over should he die, that kind of thing. So the empire actually divided into east and west. And then we also saw the kind of tension that developed around the Council of Chalcedon when Leo tried to have his tome of Leo read, and the Alexandrians flat out just said, no, we're not going to read what the Bishop of Rome has to say. That just points out the kinds of divisions that were already happening. Later on, Pope Gregory the First, who's also called the Great, clashed with the Patriarch of Constantinople because in around 600 AD, the Patriarch of Constantinople called himself the universal bishop in something that he wrote. So Pope Gregory obviously took offense at that and did not accept it because he believed that only the Bishop of Rome should have that title. So, these kinds of things, they were developing over centuries of time, little tensions, conflicts. Then there's also the issue of language. In the East, they spoke Greek. Remember, Alexander the Great went from Macedonia all the way to India and conquered that whole region of the world, and he Hellenized it. In other words, he brought Greek culture and Greek language, Greek influence. The lingua franca, the language of business and so forth, became Greek. It used to be Aramaic for hundreds of years, and then when Alexander conquered, it became Greek. That's why, by the way, the Old Testament was eventually translated from Hebrew to Greek in what we call the Septuagint version because version. I'm sorry, the Septuagint version, not virgin, because so many Jews spoke Greek and the world spoke Greek, and so Greek became the lingua franca. Greek became the language of commerce and the language of everybody's interaction with one another. And all the early theology was written in Greek. It was Greek bishops and monks and so forth who came up with our early theology. The New Testament was written in Greek. Even though Rome had conquered Palestine in the time of Jesus, they were there ruling, dominating. Really, only the military folks spoke Latin. When Jesus was crucified, Pontius Pilate put a sign over his head on the cross in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. So Latin was spoken there, but the Greek was the main language, and Aramaic there in Palestine. Many still spoke Aramaic. Jesus spoke Aramaic. But so there was a language difference because over time, the western part of the empire went more and more Latin. And they spoke Latin, and for 1,000 years, more than 1,000 years, they wrote and spoke and communicated in Latin, whereas the East continued to communicate in Greek. This caused some miscommunications, even on theological terms. There were differences in the way the languages expressed things, and Greek was more precise and so on. and this caused the separation between the bishops of the East and those of the West. Um, and then later on, of course, in about 630 after then, sometime after then, the you have the rise of Islam. And so the Muslim armies, I've done a paper on this, they conquered the whole known world in like record time. No armies or no government like Rome or Greece or even Alexander the Great has ever conquered such a broad territory in such a record short time. It's really quite an amazing thing. I could go into that some other time. But when they conquered, they took over the entire Middle East. And there were many Christian centers there. And they swept into Egypt and then through North Africa, which was all Christian before. And they took over. And so that also changed things drastically because now all the Christians of the East were dominated by the Muslims, uh, and that caused, by the way, the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, to rise in importance as well because he's now the bishop of the main city and he's ruling like he has far greater importance, whereas the bishops in the East, they're nothing. They're inconsequential because they're dominated by Muslims, right? And so the Bishop of Rome rose in prominence more and more in the West because the bishops of Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem, they couldn't even play a role. They couldn't show up to councils and so forth. And even Constantinople, which still was Christian, that was a Christian empire for 1,000 years. Um, but they were preoccupied with Islam ever since. Once the Muslims rose up, boy, they were knocking at Constantinople's doors and gates and so forth for hundreds of years until Constantinople finally fell in 1453. So they were preoccupied with that. And that caused there to be a big separation from the East and the West. And then there were the doctrinal things, many different teachings and differences in teaching and differences in doctrine, beliefs, and so forth. There are insignificant things like what's the date of Easter? I mean, they fought over this. The East had a different date for Easter than the West. They fought over it. They would not change. They would not submit to one another on that or compromise. And then whether or not priests could marry. Roman Catholic priests don't marry. They fought over that for a few hundred years before it became, the rule as it is today. The priests and monks don't marry. But the Orthodox never had such a rule. It's unbiblical. They've always married. And then a big issue was the issue of icons. And it's very strange and convoluted because, icons are paintings of Christ or the saints and so forth. And in the East, icon painting is actually like an art, but also very rigidly controlled science. You have to do it exactly a certain way and all. And the strange thing is that it kind of rose in the East, but it spread to the West as well. And then in the East, there was the iconoclastic controversy where various emperors and different Christian leaders hated icons and said they have to be destroyed. And in a way, Islam kind of brought that out because the Muslims said, you have images. We don't have images in Islam. There is no image of Allah and nor of Muhammad. We don't make images like that. That's blasphemous. That's idolatrous. You Christians, you're idolaters. You have these icons and you venerate them. And so for a time, Christian leaders said, yeah, that's right. We need to get rid of them. And then other leaders would take over and they'd say, no, we need them. And famous men, famous Christian scholars like John of Damascus, he defended icons. And, there's some interesting teaching on that and so forth. Personally, I don't believe in them. But it's interesting that the Roman Catholic Church has more of statues and so forth, but they did have icons as well. And they held that icons were okay, whereas the Greeks, they changed back and forth. And so, but that caused the difference, even though in the end, the Greeks ended up coming back to icons, and today they still have icons, but it was a big difference for a while there. And then it's very interesting. The filioque clause, the Latin side of the church, the Western church, came up with this addition to one of the creeds, which is called the filioque clause. and they added that on the Nicene Creed. And it said that the Spirit proceeded from both the Father and the Son. And the Eastern side of the church really has a problem with that. They say, no, he doesn't. The Spirit proceeds from the Father only, just as the Son is begotten from the Father only. He's not begotten of the Spirit, he's begotten of the Father. And the Spirit does not proceed from the Father and Son, he only proceeds from the Father. To be honest with you, I don't really understand the difficulty. I've read some things about it, but I don't really fully grasp it. Um, I do know that in the Bible, in the book of John, it indicates to us that the Spirit will come through Jesus. He will give, the Father gives the Spirit, and he distributes the Spirit to us through the Son. Now, of course, the reason that's true is because the Son's death on the cross cleared the way, atoned for our sins, so that we could become recipients of the Holy Spirit. So we receive the Spirit through the Son in that way. But to the Greek Orthodox, it's very important that only the Father, the Spirit proceeds from him, and the Son was sent and is generated from him, and so on. But that became a big, big issue, the filioque clause, whether the Spirit proceeds from Father and Son or just from the Father. These issues created great tension and disagreement. And I got to tell you, the way in which the two groups see salvation is quite different. And that's very interesting to me. And to be honest with you, I like a lot of things that I read in Orthodoxy. Their way of seeing salvation, I really like. Of course, there's some things about the Catholic way of seeing salvation that I really like as well. One of the things that I like is that with the Orthodox, they don't see salvation in such legal, forensic ways as we in the West do. We gradually, through various theologians throughout our history, we gradually came to see Christ's sacrifice on the cross as kind of this legal thing, this forensic thing. You know, we're guilty before God, we've committed crimes, somebody has to pay for the crimes. Jesus comes and he's our substitute. He pays, he's innocent, but he suffers in our place. And so now we're legally pardoned. So it's a forensic thing. Listen, I totally believe in that forensic thing. And I believe in that kind of atonement. The penal substitutionary form of atonement, I believe in that. But the Greek side of the church tends to emphasize not so much that forensic idea, but rather they see salvation as union with God, coming into union with God so that we might be deified. It's apotheosis, deification. That's more their view of salvation. And I have no problem with that because I believe, look, salvation isn't about, did you pray this prayer? Did you get forgiven? You know, is your name written in the book? Are you going to heaven when you die? I think salvation is supposed to be more about, are you with God? Are you in union with him? Do you know him? Does he know you? Is he in you? Are you in him? Is he making you more like Christ? It's not about where are you going to go when you die. It's more about what kind of a person are you trying to become, so that when you die, you that expands and you just become even more of that kind of person. You started in that direction, and when you're glorified, when you die, you're deified and glorified, and you fulfill all that you were supposed to be. That's more of what salvation should be. I like that. By the way, many Catholic saints saw our Christian lives not as such a forensic thing, but as it's supposed to be, an ascent to God. Some of the great mystics said our lives should be an ascent to God. We're learning about God. We're learning to know God, to spend time with him, to be sanctified by him, and to walk with him. I like that. But anyway, the approach to salvation is quite different. By the way, I also like, and you might really react to this, but I also like the Orthodox view that it's something called synergy. That salvation requires synergy. It is a cooperation of God and man. God has done the greater part. God provides salvation. We need that salvation, but we must respond and receive it and walk in it. And it's an ongoing thing as we live and allow Christ to live in us. There's a synergy. It's not that we're saved by works, but let's face it, we have to live a different way. And so I like their view. But anyway, these are some of the things that cause great differences. And by the way, it's also very interesting the differences that there were in how the two regions, East and West, interacted with civil government. Let me read a quote to you from one of my history books. It said this, quote, "In the West, the popes were practically emperors, whereas in the East, the emperors were practically popes." That's a very accurate and concise statement. See, in the West, the popes had so much civil authority and involvement in government and so forth. They coronated kings and all that, so that they practically were like kings or emperors, because they, you couldn't, the kings and all couldn't do anything without the pope's approval. So in the West, the popes were like emperors, whereas in the East, the emperors were practically popes. In other words, because the emperor of Constantinople, he would tell the church what to do. He would tell the patriarch what to do. Sometimes he even put one in and took one out or whatever. The emperors in the East really meddled with church affairs. So they were practically church officials. I mean, the government officials were practically church officials. And so it's interesting because the Eastern Church never had the political power that the Western Church did. They never did. They didn't have political power in the East. And then when Islam took over, forget about it. There was no political power at all, right? The Christian leaders were subdued. You had to just have your church service, and you can't do much beyond that. They also didn't ever have the theological and intellectual development that the West did. Not to say that the East was not theological or speculative. The greatest theologians were in the first centuries of the church history were in the East. But later they kind of changed their approach, and they were more into being mystical and just, union with God and so forth. They didn't get into all the nitpicking theology that the West did. They didn't have all the theological development that the West did. And that's quite a major difference. And I've already mentioned iconoclasm. That was a big thing in the 8th and 9th centuries. The East outlawed icons, the West allowed them. And then the West tried to interfere with the East and said, hey, you should have icons. And the East resented that. And the East changed back and forth. Then they ended up, reinstating belief in icons. But these are things that cause differences. Here's let me tell you another incident. Nicholas I was Pope from 858 to 867. And he, in line with other popes, he sought to extend papal authority. He wanted the Pope to be more and more important. And so when the Emperor Michael in the East, he deposed the Patriarch Ignatius. The Patriarch of Constantinople was named Ignatius during his time. And this patriarch refused communion to the emperor's uncle Bardas, a man named Bardas. And so the Emperor Michael said, you're not going to give communion to my uncle? You're out. And he deposed the patriarch. And then he put a guy named Photius in his place. Well, this Ignatius guy, he appealed to the Pope, Nicholas, over in Rome for help. He said, hey, this emperor has kicked me out. I'm the church official here. So Nicholas, the Pope, he said, you know what? This guy Photius that the emperor has put in, I declare him deposed. The emperor had no right to do that. So Photius is deposed. The Pope said that from Rome. Well, you can imagine how the emperor of the great Christian empire of Byzantium, there in Constantinople, you can imagine how offensive it was to this guy Michael and to his people. Who is this guy off in Italy somewhere telling us who's going to be our patriarch? I said that Photius is the patriarch and Ignatius is out. So, not just the emperor, but all the people there of Constantinople, they were highly offended at the Pope. And then Photius, the guy who the Pope had put in there, he responded to Michael by gathering a synod of the people there in the East. And he accused the Pope and the Western Church of heresy. So see, this stuff, man, this was back in the 800s. This was going on for a long, long time. He said the Pope is a heretic. The Western Church is filled with heresy. Look at what they did about this filioque clause on their own. They just said that the Father and the Son give the Spirit. That's wrong. And so he he said, I'm not going to listen to Nicholas the Pope at all. I don't submit to him at all. So this is just an incident I'm sharing with you because you can see here how the chasm between the two regions was just getting greater and greater over these years. And by the way, it's interesting because this Emperor Michael is the guy, and the Patriarch Photius, or I can't remember if it's Photius or Ignatius, but I think it's Photius. But anyway, the Emperor Michael and the Patriarch of Constantinople are the ones who sent a man by the name of Saint Cyril to a group called the Khazars in Russia, and later they sent him to Moravia. Now Saint Cyril is the one who taught the Russians their language, and that's why it's called Cyrillic today, the Cyrillic alphabet. He was from Thessalonica, Greece, but he knew Slavic languages because the Slavs invaded there. And so they sent him over to deal with the Khazars. He knew about Judaism too, Saint Cyril. And he was a great saint who brought the gospel to Ukraine and to the Russians, the Slavic peoples, and so forth. These people called the Khazars. He went to Moravia, which is where Czech Republic and all that is. He brought the gospel there, and he taught these people their language. The Bible was translated into what was called Church Slavonic because of Cyril, Saint Cyril, or Cyril. It's said both ways. And so these divisions were going on for a long time. By the way, I didn't mention the Eastern Christian leaders also saw the West as being barbaric, because they had civilization for hundreds and hundreds of years, whereas in the West you had these hordes of barbarians, these people living out in the forest, they got long hair, swords, and they're savages out there. They're ignorant, and the Easterners also heard that there were popes leading armies and engaged in all these secular activities they shouldn't be involved with. And so to them, it was like, these people are heretics. They're off. So these are just some of the developments that caused the Great Schism. Now, in 1054 is when the final break happened. The most historic date, I said the final break. It's not exactly the final break, but it's a year that people point to. It's when it became really kind of official. It occurred because the Pope sent his legate, a guy by the name of Cardinal Humbertus, to demand that Michael Cerularius, the Patriarch of Constantinople, submit to papal authority. So the Pope sent this guy, Humbertus, to Michael Cerularius, the Patriarch of Constantinople, to demand that he submit to the Pope, to papal authority. Humbertus, he came in to the church there, the Basilica in Constantinople, and he marched right up to the altar, and he put the Pope's decree in writing there, a scroll, upon the altar in the church, saying, you are hereby excommunicated by the Pope. He doesn't want you to be the patriarch over here anymore. Well, what did the patriarch of the capital of the world, Constantinople, think of these legates putting that up, interrupting his service and doing that? He responded by saying, you know what? I'm excommunicating the Pope. So the Pope said he was excommunicated, and he said the Pope was excommunicated. Isn't this wonderful? Isn't the church world just wonderful? Don't we all? Can't you just feel the love? And so, interestingly enough, by this time, unknown to both the Catholic legates there and Michael Cerularius, unknown to both of them, the Pope had actually died. He sent the legates. It took them a while to travel over there to Constantinople. And during their trip over there, he died. And actually, that technically rendered their authority null and void because the Pope who had sent him was dead. So really, they didn't even have that authority to excommunicate Michael Cerularius, but nobody knew that. And so he excommunicated them, excommunicated the Pope. And so again, as I say, all of this had been developing for years, and it continued afterward for many centuries. And it grieves both Roman Catholics and Orthodox believers that we're separated like this. It grieves them because Jesus prayed that the church would be one, and this seems to be just a scandal to the whole world. And they have tried to reconcile over the years. In fact, in 1439, when Constantinople was really feeling the pressure of the Muslims, they were in danger. They actually sent representatives to Rome and to Florence, Italy, because they were trying to reconcile. And the reason was they really wanted the Roman Church, the Western world, the Western Empire, to help them against the Muslims. Can you imagine this? The Christian world was threatened by the Muslim rising, the rise of Islam. And they go to ask, can we reconcile because we have enemies here? Please, can you help us? And they did work at it for some period of time there in this council in 1439. But they arrived at a few points of agreement and so forth, but it really didn't pan out to be any kind of real reconciliation. So the East and West were still divided to this day. The first schism was with the Oriental Orthodox. I told you about the Assyrians, the Coptics, and all that. But the second major schism, the one we most know about today, was between Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic, the Western Church. Of course, then there's going to be one other great schism, which I'll deal with later, the Protestant Reformation, which began in around the 1500s. But we'll deal with that next time. Let me just mention. Well, no, okay, we'll just deal with that next time. In an upcoming lecture, I'm going to talk more about the rise of Islam and kind of the reaction to that, which was the Crusades. I hope you'll tune into that.